Over the past few months, gaming laptops have been getting really good. And I don't just mean in terms of performance, I mean things like gaming laptops with 10 hours of battery life, 144Hz screens that are as bright as MacBook Pros, and color accurate enough for content creation, making them very flexible in terms of who the laptop is good for. And Razer laptops generally do fairly well in those other areas, right? Like a good keyboard, trackpad, battery life, upgradability, a nice screen, things other than gaming performance. So the way I want to approach this video is to look at the user experience as a whole, how many compromises do I experience, and what could Razer improve to make it great for both gaming and everyday use. So like an overall great laptop with as few compromises as possible while maintaining good, but not necessarily the best performance, right? Okay, starting with the build, I unfortunately do not have the previous model to compare side by side, but I did review it before and it seems identical from what I can remember of it. There's very little flex on the screen and on the keyboard deck. The hinge is great, it's able to be opened with one hand, but it's able to maintain its position even when closed halfway. It's not loose enough to fall shut with a bit of force and gravity. It's tuned basically perfectly. The rubber feet on the bottom are quite grippy and they give a good amount of room for air intake on the bottom. If there's one thing that I would criticize, it's the mesh filters on the speaker grills. If you want like the ultimate build quality, I would drill the holes right into the aluminum rather than use a separate mesh filter that you can, in theory, peel off. That's the way MacBooks do it, and if you're paying $1,600 for a laptop with a GTX 1660 Ti in 2020, I think Razer could do just a little bit better. It's not a big deal, just something that they could improve. There's also the green LED lit logo on the top of the screen. I think they should change it to the one on the Blade 13 with the whole black on black logo. I think that one looks much nicer. The keyboard type's the same as last year, very shallow key travel, not very tactile, kind of mushy if I'm being honest. Ever since the Blade 15 came out back in like 2018, I believe, they have had keyboards with fairly shallow key travel compared to other laptops. I would say it's similar to the new 16-inch MacBook Pro, so like the ones with the scissor switches. I can't quite remember how it compares in terms of tactility, but I don't think most people are going to find this keyboard particularly comfortable. Not to say it's bad, it's just not like, wow, this is really nice to type on. But to give a comparison against other gaming laptops to give you an idea of how good or bad it is, it's not as good as the Helios 300, the TUF A15, or the Omen 15, and I would say it's fairly similar to the Lenovo Y740 that also had a fairly shallow key travel and wasn't very tactile. Overall, I would consider this below average for a gaming laptop, specifically in terms of typing experience. One nice change they made is the full-size right shift. I'm someone who uses the right shift a lot, and it's certainly a compromise between making the arrow keys or the right shift easier to use. And because the speakers are upward firing beside the keyboard, there's just not enough room to use a 10 keyless layout like the Omen 15, but they might be able to find a way to fit a 65% layout on here. I think 65% is a great compromise since it only uses up one extra column and you get full-size arrow keys. The trackpad on this is actually really good. I think this is one of the best Windows trackpads on the market right now. It uses a glass surface with what feels like a soft touch finish, kind of like silicone, and it is very smooth. When you're using something like drag and drop, so you're pushing your finger down across the trackpad, it is still very smooth. There's no feeling of resistance or friction here. The tracking accuracy is very good, and it even handles small movements very well, which is one of the weaker aspects of Windows trackpads in general. Last year, the base $1,600 configuration came with a 1080p 60Hz screen, which was really strange because who's going to buy a gaming laptop and pay that much for a 60Hz screen? This year, the base model has been bumped up to a 1080p 144Hz panel. It's the same one that you'll find on like 95% of all gaming laptops above $1,000. Although with my particular unit, and keep in mind that two identical laptops with the same panel and everything can have a fairly large difference in measurements, the color accuracy on mine is spot on, literally perfect right out of the box. The only thing that's not very good is the contrast ratio, but it's otherwise very good. It's fast, there's no ghosting, and just about what you would expect. One thing that I found quite interesting with the speakers is the sound signature changes dramatically when you're not directly above the speakers. You can audibly hear the mid-range and vocals become muffled and hollow sounding when you sit a little bit further back, and you might think this is to be expected, but it's not. This is the first time I have noted in a review of mine that a laptop with upward firing speakers sounded noticeably muffled when my ears weren't positioned directly above the speakers. They should also throw in a subwoofer to fill out the low end. I think that would make these sound much nicer. On the left, you have your charging port, Gigabit Ethernet, a USB-A port, USB-C, a headphone jack, and on the right, an HDMI 2.0 port, 2 more USB-As, and a second USB-C port. One of those USB-C ports also supports Thunderbolt 3. I just don't know which side it's on because I don't have a Thunderbolt 3 device. Also, whoever designed the charging cable is terrible at their job, because if you have it come down the side of the laptop, it blocks the Ethernet port, and whatever device you have plugged into the USB port gets pushed downwards by the power cable, putting stress on the USB port. But otherwise, pretty standard selection of ports. Getting inside is still super easy. There's only a couple screws, no clips holding the bottom panel in place, and you get access to 2 RAM slots, 2 M.2 slots, and the Wi-Fi card. They got rid of the 2.5-inch drive slot for a second M.2 slot, so now there's this huge empty space beside the battery. If you're wondering why they didn't add a third M.2 slot, it's because there's simply not enough PCIe lanes. 16 lanes, just like the Ryzen 4000 CPUs. One thing to note, the advanced model only has 1 M.2 slot, whereas this has 2, so that's something to consider. I noticed that when I manually set the fans to full speed, they didn't get quite as loud as other gaming laptops, and when you have manual fan control, I consider that a bad thing, because if you don't care about fan noise, like if you're in a room by yourself, you can run the fans faster and louder for better thermals, and if you do care about fan noise, like if you're in a public space, just lower them for quieter operation. The thermals are good, but that's only because Razer gimps the power limit. With creator mode enabled, which means you're putting the power in the CPU can only boost to 45 watts, and without it, it can only boost to 35 watts, which is lower than base clock. Gaming performance is good overall, nothing really to note here other than you could definitely get a little bit more performance if Razer didn't put a power limit on this laptop. Compared to the previous model, the surface temperatures have gotten significantly worse. I don't know what happened with this 2020 model, but this is serious. Even though the palm rest area is nowhere near the CPU or the GPU, it still gets hot enough to burn. At 50 degrees Celsius, it takes around 2 minutes to cause a 3rd degree burn, and at 60 degrees, it takes 3 seconds. This was tested with Doom Eternal. It's a pretty popular video game, not a synthetic stress test, so Razer needs to fix it because it is now a health and safety issue, not about performance. And to reiterate, the previous model does not get hot enough to burn. It's still hot. Metal is a pretty good thermal conductor, but it's not uncomfortably hot. There's a 65 watt-hour battery, which should last you between 4 to 4.5 hours of battery life. Most gaming laptops will not last 8 hours, which means you'll need to bring your charger with you if you're working a full-time job. And because of this, I'm curious to know in the comments what you consider acceptable battery life on a 15-inch gaming laptop. Okay, so conclusion time. I think it really comes down to the keyboard and the screen. They're not very good, even compared to laptops around $800 to $1,000. Those laptops are getting really good now, partly because of the cheaper Ryzen CPUs. If those two things were actually good on the Blade 15, I would genuinely recommend this laptop, because an RTX 2060 is what I consider to be the sweet spot in terms of performance at 1080p and also value. And because most gamers will have a mouse plugged in and probably a pair of headphones, you can put the trackpad and the speakers relatively low on the priority list, which means the part of the laptop you're interfacing with is the keyboard and the screen. And if that is what you're looking for in a gaming laptop, and you've got around $1,600, maybe a little bit more, I would take a look at the Lenovo Legion 7. Just to be clear, I haven't reviewed that laptop myself, but most of the Lenovo laptops I've personally reviewed have had fairly good keyboards, including the Y740 from last year. And the new Legion 7 also comes with a brighter 500 nit 144Hz screen, so I would recommend checking that out if you're interested. But let's assume that you still want the base 15 base model and you want to know at what price you should buy it at. Going off of my custom keyboards, which are also CNC milled anodized aluminum, I would value the case of the Blade 15 at around $200. So honestly, $1,300 to $1,400 tops is what I would recommend the Blade 15 base model at. And that is the end of this review. Also, if you've been watching my videos lately, you enjoy them, and you haven't subscribed, you should do so. It makes my channel look cool, which makes companies want to send me review units for laptops you guys are interested in. And okay, that's the end of this video. I'll see you in another 14 days, assuming I remember to make a video.